Okay, we are ready to go. Call the meeting to order and begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Do I have a motion to approve the evening's agenda?
So moved.
Moved by Kim Nelson.
Second.
Seconded by Dave Klott. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Okay. Update meeting overview. I think I'll turn it over to...
Can I just ask a question first? So are we using the mics tonight or not?
Yeah.
We are using mics tonight, okay.
Are they are working then?
Okay, yeah, I wasn't sure. And then, as far as, is this meeting going to be recorded and being on YouTube? I just didn't know how that was going to work prior to the interview situation, but maybe we can cross that
I
bridge.
have never... I have never figured out that system. Ashley, is our recording system working, and are we broadcasting this?
Mr. Olson will address that. Okay, perfect, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I think I'll just jump into that question right now, if that's okay. I mean, so one of the things that you want to try to make sure that happens is that all of the candidates are on a level playing field. So there may be some savvy candidates. In fact, savvy candidates will be searching your website and looking for information. So if there's discussion, which there will be tonight, about questions that would be involved in the interview process, you may want to hold off posting a meeting or posting that portion of the meeting until such time as as the candidates are selected. But again, that's up to you. That's, I'd say, what most districts do, but some post it, and they find out if there are savvy candidates.
Okay. This is a formal introduction. You people don't need one, but this is Mr. Jeff Olson, who is the MSBA liaison that is going to help us with this process.
Well, good evening. Thank you again for engaging and having MSBA as a part of this process. We appreciate the opportunity to work with the Albert Lea School Board, the Albert Lea District, and the Albert Lea community in selecting your next superintendent. There are three key items that we're going to review to kind of thematically tonight. The first one would be the stakeholder survey results. The second will be information that would be considered interview training and preparation. That's really the primary focus of tonight's meeting. The third would be we'll do some discussion of round one questions and the round one schedule, and we will want to talk that through a little bit in terms of the potential number of candidates who you might select to interview in the first round and how that can impact or affect the schedule. And then we'll briefly talk about the round two process. We'll have an opportunity to do that in more depth and detail when we have the candidate selection meeting, which I believe is on the 17th of May. So I'm going to refer to, obviously, the agenda that's out in front of you. We're going to talk through the survey, vacancy brochure, review the timeline. I'll reference some things in the training manual. You'll see that training manual is quite extensive. I will not read through the training manual line by line, but I will reference some of the key points there that we think are important to talk about. And then we'll talk about round one questions, round one schedule, and some possible round two information, as I mentioned. So let's start with the Stakeholder Engagement Superintendent Search Survey results. The first thing I want to mention is you should feel really good about the fact there were 616 individuals or respondents on the survey. I think that's really an outstanding response. Typically, and it's kind of a wonky statistic, about 12% of the student population of a school district is what we see on the average in responses. I'm not that statistically wonky, but we do have people in the MSBA office who are, and they look at that information. And so 12% would be around 425. That would have been an average response for your district. You have 616. And you have quite a mix of parents, staff members, community members, business members, et cetera. I think another key point is that the survey results reflect the kinds of things that you talked about in your vacancy brochure. So collaborative leadership, honesty, and ethics, being able to develop and direct an effective leadership team, being a problem solver, an effective communicator. Those are all key things that showed up in the survey, or excuse me, in the survey and your vacancy brochure. Some of the other pieces that were, I think, important themes that showed up out of that survey, information and expertise in budget and finance, public relations, curriculum development and evaluation, the whole idea of strategic planning or school reform, diversity, equity, and inclusion, having that as an area. And as I'll indicate to you when we talk about the round one questions, the round one questions are designed to reflect any number of those items from both the vacancy brochure and from the survey. So I think that's important. When you move through the survey, there are some themes that came out of the comments that were made in the survey. And these comments are, the comments that you see listed are those that are representative of those themes, so that they were recurring and they weren't just an isolated one or two kind of responses. They were more representative of multiple responses. So some of the good things taking place in the Albert Lea area schools. Albert Lea area schools has caring, capable, collaborative staff that goes above and beyond for each student, so a lot about staff. The community is excited about the advancement the district is making to facilities, professional development, student academic success, and student access to technology. The Albert Lea School District does everything it can to meet student needs through a variety of curricular, co-curricular, and extracurricular programs. A lot of positive comments there. In terms of some of the challenges, the community has divergent visions for the district moving forward. They want the next superintendent to bridge the gap between the differing opinions and rebuild the trust in the community. The Albert Lea community understands the district is having trouble recruiting and retaining staff. They would like the district to address the dwindling staff morale and mistrust between staff and administrations. That's a theme. The Albert Lea community would like the district to focus on improving student engagement and academic achievement. They're concerned about the impact the pandemic has had on student learning and motivation. The community wants the district to implement programs to address student mental health and discipline. The community wants the next superintendent to be visible, collaborative, a strong communicator, both in the district and the community. The community wants the next superintendent to be personable, strong-willed, transparent, supportive, and have strong leadership skills. Albert Lea wants the next superintendent to help rebuild trust between the community, the district, the staff, the administration. The Albert Lea community wants the next superintendent to understand the history and demographics of the community. And then additional comments. The Albert Lea community wants the next superintendent to be collaborative and have strong leadership skills. So again, as we've done a number of surveys like this with other districts, these are not uncommon kinds of things that you see. I think particularly with some of the tough times that districts have gone through with the pandemic and issues surrounding the pandemic and all of those kinds of things. So any questions on the brief recap of those survey results?
Just a quick question. Is this a public document?
It is.
We have Albert Lea, L-E-E?
Yeah, that's corrected.
Okay. All right. Good. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Is this something we're able to share with people, or cannot do that?
I think that's a question. If there's something you could certainly, you could post on your website if you chose to. It is a public document, so you can elect to do that. That's, I think, up to the board to decide in terms of what you want to do with it.
And these are only a representative.
Correct.
So are we able to see the full list of responses?
Yeah, I believe you are. I don't have access to those full list of responses, but that's something that we could check with the MSBA staff on.
It does kind of jump out, although I didn't catch it today. Lee is spelled L-E-A.
Yes, yeah, we apologize for that. That's been corrected, and it's up on the board. It is corrected.
Oh, okay, cool.
So if we do want the full list of comments, we would just email you guys?
Yes.
Okay.
Any other questions there? All right. So one of the things that's important is there are really a couple of different input opportunities for the stakeholders in the district. This is really the big one. So as you start thinking about the candidates that you're going to want to move forward to interview for the position of superintendent of the Albert Lea Public Schools, keeping in mind the kind of input that you're receiving here is important. We'd also encourage you to take a look at the Q&A session. And we have talked about maybe trying to boost that a little bit. I think as of 3 o'clock today, there were 31 people who had observed or watched that Q&A session. So if those numbers can increase, that's helpful as well, I think, just in terms of getting a flavor for the process, how the process works, and the data behind that process. Any other questions on this item? So the next thing I want to do is talk about review that vacancy brochure, and that's something that we talked about in the planning meeting. In specific, I'm going to refer to the second page and the leadership profile in the upper left-hand corner. Again, these are the kinds of things that came out of the input that we received from the school board as a part of that planning process. So you're seeking a superintendent with proven leadership experience, and some of the keys there are acting with honesty and in an ethical manner with the board, the staff, and the community, developing and directing an effective leadership team, working cooperatively with the school board in providing options and recommendations, being a visionary and creative thinker, having experience in school district management practices, and I know that during that meeting, that planning meeting, you talked about budget and finances being one of those management practices that you were certainly interested in. Following the school board's chosen educational philosophy, which reflect the community's values. Having knowledge of and expertise with negotiations and the collective bargaining process. Now, it's kind of interesting when you look back on the survey, there was almost a 50-50 split in terms of should the person have previous superintendent experience. So I think your statement, previous superintendent experience is preferred but not required, really does reflect about that 50-50 split that you saw in those survey results. And just again to point out, from both the survey and these leadership profile points, these are the points that we're helping to inform the draft set of round one questions that we're going to talk about a little bit later on in the meeting this evening. I also want to mention, you've talked about a comprehensive compensation package will be negotiated commensurate with experience and qualifications. And that contract length is negotiable as provided by Minnesota statute, and the maximum length of a contract under Minnesota statute is 3 years. And oftentimes that's a typical contract that would be negotiated with a candidate. But it doesn't have to be. Again, that's a board decision. We talked about in the planning meeting the process for the negotiations of the contract, and I think you've laid that out. You've got that clear. Any questions about that at all from anybody?
It would, in other words, be similar to our arrangement negotiation.
Correct. Correct.
Would include me as a board.
Yes. Yeah. And if oftentimes if you have, whether it's a full committee or a board at a meeting or a study session, to talk about some contract parameters in advance, oftentimes that's the case as well. Yes.
You talked about the contract, that 3 years is the max. In most situations, when a new superintendent comes in, do you use like the first year as a probationary year, or is the norm to go with 3 years right away, or what's the best
I think most candidates would probably be looking for a multi-year contract, probably a 3-year in most cases. Especially if they're experienced and they're sitting in another position, they're going to want that. But again, and you have the evaluation process on an annual basis to provide that input in terms of how they're doing. Other questions on that? Well, let's take a look at the timeline. The couple of things I want to highlight there, May 10th is the application deadline. And one of the things that's been interesting in the last month or so, in terms of a couple of other superintendent searches that I've been involved with, and then we do a regular meeting call with all of the people like myself who are project leads and superintendent searches around Minnesota. And I think we mentioned MSBA has been involved with about 33 searches this year. So one of the things that's something that we haven't seen in the past is that there's like a late flurry of applicants. So just a couple of applicants right now, and it's like that last weekend, it seems like, boom, they pop. But we're not seeing the 15 to 20 applicants or the 20 to 25 applicants that we saw 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. It's more in that 6 to 10 kind of range. And again, a little bit late in the process right now, that would be a good number of applicants to get. So we don't know what's going to happen for sure. That would be, I think in a good setting, what we'd hope to see with those applicants.
How many applicants now?
2. That was as of 10:30 this morning. So most often people aren't filling out applicants during the day. It's that weekend where you typically see the applicants filling things out. So between May 11th and 17th, MSBA will conduct screening and preliminary verification of references. And we do some pre-interviews, so we'll talk to the candidates, we'll talk to references, we'll review their papers, their applications, etc. You also will have an opportunity between May 12th and 17th to review applications. And there'll be a process of being able to receive those applications electronically. The one thing that we want to make sure that we really stress is that the applications are private until such time as you name a candidate to be interviewed. And it's not the final candidate to be interviewed, it's a candidate to be interviewed. So when you name your candidates for the first round interview, generally that night, after you've been referring to candidates as candidate A, candidate B, candidate E, etc., then you'll indicate John Doe, Mary Smith, etc., are the individuals. And then information will be, available about, those candidates' work history and where they're currently employed, and etc. So just as a reminder, you will get those electronically. They do need, all of that information needs to remain private and confidential until such time as those candidates are named to be interviewed. If you choose not to review them on the electronic format, then we'd suggest you come into the board district office, and whatever kind of process you have to review papers at that point in time would be appropriate. Those application materials then also need to be kept on file in the district office. And I'm fairly confident of these years. I think it's 2 years for candidates who are named to be interviewed and 6 years for the candidate who's actually selected. So for multiple years, those papers will need to be kept in place. In private. Yes. We will email you a list of recommended candidates for round 1 interviews. And you may agree that those are the candidates that you would want to interview, but you also may have other candidates you want to interview. It isn't totally uncommon for a board to say, I like candidate C. And there may be a question from you to me as we're going through that process that evening on May 17th about, was there a specific reason that you didn't recommend candidate C? Generally, the reason is we have a team of 4 people who review all of those applicants and do some of those reference checks, and we don't reach consensus that candidate C is at the top of the heap to match your vacancy profile. But again, there may be some things that you see in a particular candidate. That's one of the things that we want to stress, is this really is a school board-driven process. So if you elect to interview somebody else, then that candidate will be contacted and interviews will be set up with them as well. We also will make sure that we finalize those round one questions and the schedule. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we move along for that May 17th meeting where you determine that you're going to select the finalists. And one of the things that we stress both in that meeting and when you get to deliberations is that you're really focusing on the positive attributes of the candidates. And sometimes what we've seen happen, and in fact, a couple of years ago I was involved in a search like this, where the first candidate that ended up making it through the process and being offered the position, after accepting it initially, turned it down, and then the board went back to a second candidate who was a close second, and the first question I was asked is, was the board positive? Were they negative about me at all? And I was like, no, they were very positive about you, and the person was more than happy to accept the position. So I think it's important to stay on those positive attributes when you're discussing candidates. And if there aren't a lot of positive attributes in your minds or in the discussion of deliberations or of candidate selection, then that's telling as well, I think. So then May 23rd and 24th are set to be the first round of interviews. One of the things that has changed there is that May 24th meeting, as you'll note, has been shifted to start at 1 p.m. and it will need to be concluded no later than, and you'll see this on the schedule, we're putting 5:55 p.m. or earlier because that is a primary election day and there cannot be board meetings between 6 and 8 p.m. on that day. Now, if you elect to move fewer than 5 or 6 candidates forward, you could potentially, and we've had districts that do this, interview 4 candidates on that first night on May 24th. But again, that's something we can talk about as you get into that candidate selection process. But where we're sitting right now is you've got 6 slots for interviews on that round one process. May 26th then is the round 2 meeting date. And then following that, there are reference checks. And I think at that planning meeting we talked, and Neil, that's you who will be conducting those reference checks of those candidates. And that's between May 24th and May 26th. So when you get to your deliberation on the May 26th candidates, one of the pieces of data you'll have is your information on the reference checks that you've done to share with the board before you start those actual deliberations about who you are going to determine to offer that position to be the next superintendent of the Albert Lea Public Schools. And then the negotiations process starts, and you've got a meeting set for June 6th at 5 p.m., your regular meeting, where you would be in a position, we hope, to approve an employment contract for the next superintendent of Albert Lea. Questions on the timeline or anything I've mentioned?
I have a couple questions.
Yeah.
One, some community members have asked if there could be a time to have maybe an open house, something like that, for the community or staff to meet the candidates. Is that something that people do? I know we don't have a lot of time at all to do that, but.
There are districts who have done something like that on as they move into the second round, typically not the first round.
Okay.
But that's something you could discuss and talk about.
If we did something like that, would that need to happen before, like that same day as the second round?
Typically, it would happen before the second round interviews start.
Okay. Then my other question is, let's say we get through this and we don't find somebody that's a good fit and we get an interim. Could you help me understand how does that process work? And then when would we start again next year? What's the ideal time frame to start?
Very, very good questions. So the MSBA would help you identify an individual or individuals who you might interview. The interview is really almost sometimes more of a conversation at a public meeting with a particular interim candidate. And there are some questions that we could help you with, or some probes that you might want to be talking about with an interim. Kind of in an ideal world, you'd really start that process of opening up the application window maybe mid-December or early January. So you're really set to start that interview process in late January, early February, conclude it no later than maybe mid-February, at the latest probably March 1. So kind of that's that sweet spot. What we've seen is a lot of candidates almost right about that mid-year time, that holiday break time, start thinking about, maybe I'm interested in taking a look at another district and what's out there. And so does that answer those questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
And how does the second round of interviews work? If we have on the 26th, we have our reference check, and we hold the second round of interviews, how can that happen on that same day?
No, the reference checks would need to be conducted, I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear, after May 24th and before May 26th, before the meeting.
Right, and then who is involved then in that second round of interviews? Because then we're to select the lone finalist that same night. So I'm not understanding the second round of interviews.
Yeah, so let's just say that you do interview 6 people in round 1, and you move 2 or 3 candidates into round 2. You would interview those 2 or 3 candidates on May 26th, and at the end of that interview night, you would deliberate and determine if you have somebody that you feel you want to move forward with and offer a contract to.
So then we, on the 24th, would have to have made our decision about who moves ahead.
Yes, and if you had fewer than 6, it could be on the 23rd as well, but yes. Yep.
Is that enough time for background checks? 1 day?
Well, it would only be for the finalists, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think we've seen that, Board Member Olson, we've seen that happen, because you've got that Wednesday, but you also have then that Thursday up until mid-afternoon generally.
And when do you anticipate emailing us your recommended list of the first interviews?
We would try to get those to you probably the 16th or 17th. Again, it depends on, for sure by the 16th or 17th, because we have, again, a number of people who are working on those candidates. Again, if there are 6 candidates, doing those background checks, doing those pre-interviews, et cetera. Anything else on the timeline? Okay, so let's move to the School Board Interview Training and Preparation Manual. I think the key here is we really want to talk about things that keep everybody on the legal side. So we're really talking about things that can and can't happen or shouldn't happen during an interview process, and things that should happen during an interview process. So I'm going to start by referencing page 2. There are some don't ask kinds of statements or points that are made there. And really the bottom line is that there are both state and federal law prohibit questions regarding protected categories or indirect questions regarding protected categories. So some of those are listed below, in terms of race, national origin, age, familial status, et cetera. You can read through that list of protected categories. And an indirect question that might get at the protected categories would be, for an example, that first bullet. How much longer do you plan to work before you retire? So the answer to that question may reveal information that discriminates with regard to age. So again, you can look at that. Do you own a home? Have you ever filed for bankruptcy? What about dependent care, et cetera. So really, you just need to stay on the side where you don't ask questions that are focused on or referencing those protected categories. Also avoiding questions that are not job-related, so that's pages 3 and 4. I'm going to start on page 3. Questions about will you live in the district? So that's one that's come up quite a bit in different searches that we've been involved in. And, in terms of school employees, including superintendents, you can't require a superintendent to live in the district. And you really can't ask a question then about would they live in the district. A candidate may offer that to you, but that can't be a question that you ask as a part of that interview process. Or are you married? Or would your spouse move with you if you got this position? Or again, when we talked about when do you plan to retire? Or a question about military status. If the candidate is a member of the National Guard, for an example, will you miss work because you're a member of the National Guard? Again, that's a question that you really can't ask. So I just suggest that you look through that information at some detail, but I think I've hit on some of those particular highlights. Again, one sometimes comes up, what does your spouse do for a living? And what that question is kind of designed to say is, well, is your spouse able to move if you're going to move to the district? So that's an indirect way of trying to get at that question. I'd like to then next reference page 7. And you probably have Model Policy 401, so I'm just referencing some of those policies that you already have in place, but just want to point out Roman numeral 2A. The school district does not unlawfully discriminate on the basis of race, color, creed, religion, national origin, sex, marital status, status with regard to public assistance, disability, sexual orientation, including gender identity or expression, age, family care, leave status, or veteran status. The school district also makes reasonable accommodations for disabled employees. But again, that's the legal statement, but you have that as a part of your policy as well. Also want to then shift to page 10. And at the top of page 10, letter F. So the question is, when does information become public? And we've talked about this, just again to note that. A finalist means an individual who is selected to be interviewed by the school board for a position. So once you select candidate A, B, and E, then those names are public and should be made public at that point in time. I'll just stop there. I've run through quite a bit of information pretty quickly. Any questions?
I suppose on the finalist situation, it's been selected to be interviewed and also agreed finally to be interviewed too, right? Because that's, something you're going to present, but at the last minute, they choose not to be interviewed, then that would be
Well,
6 to 5 or something like that.
Yeah, you would select them to be interviewed, and as soon as the meeting is over with, I'll call them, and they'll have to determine. But you will have already named them as a potential finalist before that, yes. And, one of the questions we ask in our pre-interview, although sometimes things change, but rarely, is, I'll ask this question very specifically. Are you really interested in this position? Because the board's going to invest a lot of time, effort, and energy, and so are you, in going through the interview process. So we want to make sure, if we're going to recommend you to be a candidate that will be interviewed, that you are interested and you want to move forward and you want to accept the position should it be offered to you. That's not a guarantee, but we're pushing that hard.
Is it unusual for a candidate or a candidate to withdraw from the process? I know typically in the question and answer or the interview of candidates, there's at the end an opportunity for the candidates to ask questions.
Yeah. It's not typical, but it does happen. And, it happens for lots of different reasons. the candidate is moving through the process and they're excited and they get home after they're offered the second round of interviews and they tell their family, and let's say they have kids that are in high school and they're like, I don't think so. And so I would hope that you would have maybe talked that through in advance, but sometimes that's not the case. So page 18. Just that point that we made again during the planning meeting process, all of the meetings in this process are open meetings, so they are open to the public. Anytime you have a gathering of at least a quorum or more members of the school board or a quorum of a committee or a subcommittee, then that is an open meeting, and it is open to the public, and the materials that you review are open to the public as well. So just want to make sure we reference that, and I know that you guys are doing a good job of that and posting all of that and following that as well. You probably have that policy as well. So I'm referencing the legal points of policy that you already have in place, and most districts do. On page 20, sometimes there's a question about, especially as you'll see on the round one schedule, at the end of the first night, one of the statements is the meeting is recessed until, in this case, 1 p.m. on Tuesday, May 24th in the boardroom at Brookside Education Center. So once in a while there's a question, can we really do that? And yes, you can. That's that point number 4 under recessed or continued meetings. If a meeting is a recessed or continued meeting of a previous meeting, and the time and place of the meeting was established during the previous meeting and recorded in the minutes of that meeting, then no further published or mailed notice is necessary. So you are moving to that. That's a continuation of your first round meeting, essentially, is what we're talking about.
It will be publicized as a meeting.
Yes.
So that it's really
Yep. Yep, exactly. Page 27. I'm just going to reference several items in terms of, we label them as common interview mistakes, and you can read through all of those, but I want to again reference referencing the violations of the don't ask list. So make sure that you go back and review those, make sure that you stay on top of those. One of the things that's important is that all of the candidates are asked exactly the same questions, so you don't really get to go off script on those questions. It is acceptable to say, could you clarify that, or could you please explain what, sometimes somebody will use an acronym, and you probably know this one, but let's say PBIS, and you might say, could you help me remember and understand what PBIS is referring to? So, that would be an example of a clarification question, not asking a new question. But the other piece, and we'll talk about this when we get to those questions, typically you'll determine a round-robin schedule, and each of you will ask a question. Sometimes it's just one person asking, but more often we see the entire board asking the questions. And we think, and I agree, that I think that's important. It also gets that candidate to engage with each of you as they're responding to your questions. So I think that's important. It's important that there are good questions. Vague questions lead to vague answers. Number 7, and I think you've mentioned this and kind of referenced this, we don't want the interview treated like a one-way street, because really at some level, the candidate's interviewing you at the same time that you're interviewing them. They're going to have an opportunity to ask you some questions at the end of the interview time period, at the end of their hour time period, but they're also interviewing you really during that entire time period. And they're looking to see if they think that they're a good fit with you and the community as well.
And I would assume that the demeanor of the people asking the questions would be significant.
Exactly. You are likely to be taking notes on your interview forms. One of the things that happens if those notes are taken as they're part of that interview form, those notes should be turned in and retained as part of that interview documentation that's kept on record in the district office. The other piece that, as long as we're talking about this part, I want to make sure that I mention it, is you will be asked to fill out a form at the end of each interview. It's called an EMD form. So for each of the questions, there'll be a box, and you'll have this electronically, and Ashley will be working with you on setting up some time where you can practice that. Or if you would prefer to do it in paper and turn it in to Ashley or Kathy or whomever, they can input it as well. But you'll see that's one of the reasons why there's a 15-minute time frame break, if you will, at the end of each interview, to give you a chance to kind of refer back to your notes and fill out that EMD form. E, for each question, E is exceeds what you would expect the candidate to answer on the questions. M is meets what you would expect the candidate to ask. D is does not meet. And then there's an additional one, which is a T, which we hope we don't get to. That means timed out. And what would happen then is you'll see there are like 14 questions, suggested questions in round one. If the candidate doesn't get through their responses in the allotted time frame, then the interview's over and they timed out. They didn't get a chance to answer all of the questions. I haven't seen that. Oftentimes the candidates they move pretty fast in terms of their responses. The shortest, and I don't think this was all that great, was 17 minutes, getting through all of the questions. But then, typically it's going to be in that 45 to 50 minute range. I will be sitting somewhere in a place where the candidate can hopefully see me, and I'll have a 30-minute and a 5-minute card to show them.
That would be for the entire interview.
For the entire interview.
Right.
Yeah.
They're obviously well aware of this
Yes.
and should be prepared to define their answers.
Absolutely.
In a manner that would accommodate that time.
Absolutely.
If we take notes, you're talking about the notes, are we allowed to keep ones that we took, or do we have to turn all of that in? I'm just thinking to try to remember as we're debating.
Yeah. I think you keep those through that deliberation process.
The second day is a continuation.
Yes.
Would we retain
Yes.
notes?
Through that deliberation process.
The second meeting?
Correct.
And then we would deliberate and make use of those notes, and then after that we would.
Absolutely. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. This maybe gets into a question that was asked a little bit earlier. You also don't want to accept the wrong fit. The bottom line is you're looking for a great fit for the Albert Lee School District that can, really lead this district forward in the next multiple years. So you shouldn't settle, is how I guess I would say it. If you don't feel at the end that there's a great fit, then there isn't a great fit, and then we'll talk about other options, which might include an interim and restarting that process off next year, or other options as well. But just want to make sure that I mentioned that one. Questions there? You'll see in pages 29 through 35, there are a whole bank of sample interview questions. And they're listed by category. So as an example, personnel management and administration, or school board superintendent relations. So you can see some sample questions if those are questions that you might be interested in. And again, we'll talk about that more as we get to that question section. There also will be the candidate's turn. So that's one thing that you'll might want to just think through and discuss, even if you choose to a bit tonight. Candidates will ask, if they have that 10-minute time period, hopefully, they should be prepared with maybe multiple questions they're going to ask. Some of the questions might be one individual could respond, and you can determine who might respond to that, or someone might volunteer to respond, or it might be the board chair that responds. Other questions might be something like, what are you most proud about in terms of the Albert Lee School District? What do you really think, just flies high? You'd want to put that on a billboard outside of town. And each of you might respond to that. But again, just kind of think through that, because sometimes what ends up happening is you're kind of thinking, well, who should respond to that? Again, if it's that kind of question, you all might respond. And again, the candidate's trying to get a feel for what are those things that you think are really important, but also kind of getting a read for the entire board as well.
So can you clarify, so if a candidate has answered all the questions and they have like 2 minutes left, that's what they get for asking questions?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's 60 minutes regardless?
60 minutes,
Okay.
because again, we want that to be an equal time frame for everybody, or else you might have a candidate who like just goes on and on and on and takes an hour and a half. Then you're way behind schedule and somebody's waiting out, and then I think it's important, and I'll talk with them about that very clearly. There's an hour here. You need to be complete but succinct and clear in your responses. And you do want to have time to be able to ask questions of the board at the end as well.
And our being questioned is included in that?
Yes, yes.
We have to restrict ourselves the same manner.
Exactly. Yeah, for sure. On page 37, just some sample reference check questions, but I would say this, just generally, the best question that I have seen out there that I think is a really good one is simply, you're talking to that reference check, tell me about why you think this person is a great superintendent. And you know what, they'll take off and they'll go on and on, or not. And if it's an or not, that's pretty telling in terms of your reference. But you might want to, if you have any suggestions, and Neil, you certainly can determine that. You've been involved in interviews before, or there may be other board members who might have a particular question that you think would be important to ask. Again, deliberating in the public, that's on page 38. And the key point that I want to make on that item is really focusing on the positive attributes of the candidate. Again, and I mentioned that earlier, but you'll be talking about now a candidate by name, and you're going to be referring to the things that you thought really maybe match that candidate profile, or the kinds of things that you got in terms of input from the survey. Somebody who understands budget, is a good collaborator, is a good team builder, just be really trying to focus on the strengths of the candidates and why you think that they're a great match. And sometimes that gets difficult sometimes, because you may want to say, yeah, I don't really think they answered question 17 very well. Well, you all know that they probably didn't answer question 17 very well. But is there a strength that you can pick up on the other questions? Or maybe somebody that did answer question 17 really well. Question 17 is probably a bad example. I don't even know what question 17 is right in front of me here. So, questions on that, the deliberating in public piece?
Number 17 is, do they have any questions for us?
Oh, yeah, that wouldn't be a good one to reference. I was thinking about that.
I have a question back on the references.
Yeah.
So, who determines, or how do we determine who is contacted as a reference?
They'll have references listed, but we typically would think that you would want to be talking. I think the most important thing is you're talking to somebody who has a direct employment decision on that individual. So if it's a sitting superintendent talking to a board member, the board chair, or another board member, if they have them listed or not, connect with that board chair. The candidate should know that their sitting supervisor, if you will, would be contacted. If it's a person who isn't a current superintendent, who is their direct supervisor? Sometimes it's nice that they have a colleague or a friend that's a nice reference, but you're really looking for the person who's making that decision. Because a good question might be, given the opportunity, would you hire this person for this job again? And that's, again, a pretty telling question, right? And then just at the very end, and you probably already have this figured out, if you look at page 39 through 45. That is a sample superintendent contract that is both agreed to by the Minnesota School Boards Association and by the Minnesota Association of School Administrators, in other words, the superintendents. Most of the superintendent contracts are like that, and as you start thinking about negotiating that contract, the other piece you'll see is that if you have a superintendent that's been in the district for a while, they typically have some other things that have been negotiated that may go above and beyond that core base contract. And those are some things that you can talk about as you start thinking about the parameters for contract negotiations. Those are the key points that I wanted to make from that interview training and preparation, but I would encourage you to read through some of this information again, particularly under those areas like don't ask and common interview mistakes, and et cetera, maybe before that first round.
I would assume that the contract that the candidate had previously would be a matter of public record if they were proceeding.
Yes, yes, it would.
I would assume that would probably be appropriate for the negotiating team to have access to
That might be a very good idea.
and compare that to this model from MSBA.
Yes, yes. Okay, so next item will be to take a look at the round one sample interview questions. So as you'll see, there are 17 questions, but really when you look at the questions, there are really 13 there, because the first three, the name of the candidate, the date of the interview, and the school board member aren't really questions. And 17, what questions do you have for us? That's not really a question. So just to let you know that those questions, generally the round one questions are more general in nature. You have a few more. It's in a way to think of it, it's screening more. You're taking a look at these 4 or 5 or 6 candidates, and you're asking them these 13 questions, and there are a broad number of topics. So there are questions, again, that are tied to that candidate profile around school management practices, and there's a question there about budget, about diversity, long-range and short-range operational plans, which gets kind of under that idea of strategic planning, person who is visible and accessible. I think I mentioned the one about budget. So take a look at these questions, and what I think we're interested in hearing about is, how would you like to proceed with these questions? Are you good with these questions for round one? Do you have different ideas? Would you like to modify? And as we talk about that, again, the tricky part is not actually giving the specific question out, but so it gets a little wonky. So sometimes what happens is, if you do think these questions generally are good, but you might have some other suggestions or ideas or modifications, or maybe there's an area that you really think you'd want to see in round one, you can get that to Neil, or then he can get it to Ashley, or you can go directly to Ashley or Kathy, and they can connect with me, and I can try to modify these questions based on your input and get them out to you prior to that candidate selection meeting. But
So how does that work if someone were to make a suggestion on a change one, and maybe we're not in agreement with that?
yeah,
that's not an option to do that without a meeting.
you'd come back on your candidate selection meeting and finalize those questions.
Oh, okay.
These questions specifically for Albert Lee, made up for Albert Lee?
These
Based on stakeholder engagement?
Stakeholder engagement and the candidate profile, the vacancy brochure profile, the pieces that you as board members filled out. So we really tried to tie those questions to those key categories, and if you look at those categories, you should be able to see those questions. Not all of them, because there are 13 options there, and one of them is what questions do you have for us, at the end there.
There are a couple themes that came up with the board and then with the stakeholder surveys that I would like to see maybe incorporated more, but maybe we don't want to say what those are in this forum and just email that?
I think you're okay talking about them, just
Okay.
in general.
Just in general, one that was high on everyone's list was honesty and ethics, PR and trust. Is there a way to get at those kind of, I don't really see, I see, something that might get at one of them, but I don't know if there's a way to maybe get at some of those.
Yeah, there's one in there that is kind of talking about a scenario, situation you've dealt with, kind of thing.
And then what kind of questions then are asked in the round two? Are they more intensive? We still have to ask the same questions to each candidate in round two?
Correct. You do have to ask the same questions to each candidate. They're typically fewer questions, and they're more in-depth, and they maybe more situational in nature. Like, given, I don't know if I'll do a great job of wording this question, but given the fact that there is going to be a bond referendum, how would you respond to a person who came up and told you, I already pay enough in taxes, I don't know why you think I should be paying more in taxes, I don't even have kids in school? How would you respond to that kind of question in an open meeting when you were presenting a bond referendum question to the public? So something like that, where that gets you thinking more about, all right, I mean, these are potentially real live, like real world kinds of things you're going to get asked about. How would you respond? So fewer, maybe more in depth. And again, if there are things that you think you'd like to delve more deeply into, one, you can send those through Ashley to me as well, and I can start to draft those potential questions for round two. And then secondly, you'd still have an opportunity after round one to say, one thing I'd really like to know more about from the three candidates or two candidates or whomever that we're moving forward is around the area of whatever it might be. Maybe it's financial management. How do you go about the process of involving stakeholders in a budget reduction process?
So in other words, you're saying that specific concerns that may not be dealt with, or that may still be adequately dealt with in the first round could be addressed in the
Exactly.
And that would be a result of our input
Correct.
to the process at that point.
Correct.
Makes sense.
Would we approve those second round questions at the beginning of our second round of interview?
I think we would, what our goal would be is to have a consensus around the questions. We'll have a draft set of questions that you might suggest in advance that will be available for you to review at the end of round one.
Okay.
And then at that point, we'd have to say, if there's another area, I could get that question, out there, and you could make sure that you're good to go with it, or you might want to modify it right at the start of your meeting of round two. Again, time is tight there, right? A little bit between potentially the 24th and the 26th, but I think that can be done. But I think to the point, again, if there are areas that you feel that would be good to move into the round two questions, that's another approach to making sure that you get all of those things covered.
I think, just glancing at these, they look like they're well thought out, and quite frankly, I think probably the effectiveness of the interview is more a function of the extent to which the interviewee presents themselves, and not so much a function of, because obviously questions are important, but it's their performance that's going to be more important.
Right.
So I wouldn't be overly concerned about fine-tuning these questions to the point that it becomes kind of a burden to the process. More a result of the presentation of the interviewee to the candidate.
Other thoughts? Questions? Questions on the questions?
I think it's a well-rounded list, and actually I had looked through this big bank of questions before I looked at this.
Yeah.
Questionably, so I'll probably email Neil
Okay.
if I decide to do that, so.
All right. Are we good to keep?
I think there was a sidebar conversation
No,
here.
I think we should agreeing,
Excuse me?
just as agreeing.
So let's take a look at the round one schedule. You'll see that the round one schedule is, and I think I got this answered already from Kathy and Ashley and maybe Neil before. So you see there's a yellow in the round one schedule, but I'm pretty confident this is going to be at the Brookside Education Center boardroom, correct? And this is going to be the hot seat for the candidate. So I'll make that change and get that out there. And actually, I think that may be in a micro in a Word document. You can correct that as well. So, yeah. So you'll see that 3 candidates on the first night. There's that light supper section in there. The only reason that that's there is you're starting at 4 o'clock. Sometimes it's good to just have a break between when you're going to interview those 3 people, or if you were going to potentially interview 4, to have a break in there. But you don't have to have that in there. That'll be one of the questions. And it might just be a chance to, take a break, take a little time off. It's going to be pretty intense in terms of trying to keep track of the responses to those questions, fill out those EMD forms in that 15 minutes at the end. But that's something that you should take a look at. And again, you can either give me that input now, or you can give the input and we can finalize that when we do the candidate selection meeting.
This is predicated on the assumption that we will have 6 candidates.
It is. And and I would say if you had, for example, 4 candidates, my suggestion would be to just complete that interview on May 23rd. But that's again up to you. That also gives you a little more time in terms of reference checks and time in between that first and second round.
Based upon the time of the year and, what am I trying to say? Only getting 2 candidates in 2 weeks. You think we'll get 4, 5, 6 candidates?
I think so. But again, we'll be sitting May 7th, 8th over the weekend. That's going to be the deciding factor. I would think you would. I know that there are candidates who have connected with me specifically, who are interested. To be honest, they're a little nervous about the timing and where they are in terms of the sitting in their current districts. That doesn't mean they won't apply. They may very well apply. They really have an interest in the district. But there's a little concern on the timing, just to be honest. But you don't know. The bottom line is, one point we make is don't settle, and the other point we make is you need one great candidate to come through. And I've seen a pool of 4 and the interview of 3, and there was a great candidate in there, and that district ended up with a really top-notch superintendent. So you don't know until we don't know until midnight on May 10th, I think it is.
Thank you.
And if we choose to only have 4 and complete on the 23rd, would we start earlier? Would we have time to announce that?
You could, or you could end up going from 6:50 to 7:50 to 8:35. You'd be going probably 9:35, 10 o'clock, depending upon how long you deliberate, 10:30 at night. But again, we've seen that, as opposed to coming back to that second day. So either starting earlier or just adding on at the end, whatever you determine.
Because of the short time frame with the candidates coming in, I know in some cases, sometimes they have the ability to check out things in the community. Basically, that's going to be on their own. My fear would be is we find a really good candidate and we bring them in, but they really haven't had a chance to check the community out. Is there any worry that they come in, they've been decided on, they start looking through the community and then back out right away.
Yeah,
I just worry.
I suppose that's a possibility, but I'll tell you my experience.
Okay.
My personal experience and the experience that I've seen is candidates that are really interested, they're going to be down here on May 21st and 22nd. And they're going to be in the community. They're going to be looking around. They're going to be looking at houses. They're going to be doing all kinds of things. That's typically what I would see.
I know with social media and everything, they can
Yeah.
check out a lot of things.
Yep.
there and-
So we're good. Just we'll keep this schedule for now, but again, understanding that might modify and change based on your action and activity on the 17th of May at that candidate selection meeting. So then, just briefly to review through that draft schedule for round 2. Again, I've just got 2 candidates listed there. You could end up having 3. Typically, you don't see more than 3 in round 2. But you could just determine how that would work. You just add another hour in there, and you'd almost look at like the first day of the round 1 schedule for 6 people. But that at the end of that date, just what I want to mention a couple of things there. You're obviously discussing information. You're having a motion to extend the offer of the employment contract. That offer of the employment contract is contingent on 2 things. One, the successful negotiation of an approval of a contract by the board. And then 2 would be the successful completion of the background check process that you've identified. So the motion isn't we're extending an offer of employment, is we're extending an offer of employment to John Doe contingent upon, and we'll provide information and wording for those motions as well, but just so you note that. And then you're discussing, deciding, and scheduling the steps necessary for the rest of the hiring process, but that's really, you've already talked about that. That's really that negotiations of the contract, making sure that everybody's on the same page and you're ready to act on an employment contract on, I believe it's June 6th, right? At your regular board meeting on June 6th. So
It's best to have a 7-0 vote by majority so rules, correct? I mean, for a new candidate, to see their support.
that's, yes, so your 2 points are exactly right. Candidates will often ask the question, what was the vote of the board? So obviously being unanimous is good. I think if there's a really tight vote, let's say it's a 4-3 vote, they might have a second thought about that. I think that I've seen that happen before. But again, you deliberate, you vote, majority determines, and then that's how we move ahead. And we'll contact the candidate, especially that second round when you identify the candidate. I'm going to step out of the meeting as quickly as I possibly can and get a hold of that candidate and tell them that if you've made that offer of employment, and are they on board, they're really accepted, ready to start negotiations that next day. And I'll come back and hopefully do that. And we'll be in the right spot. So again, and I think we talked about this, just want to mention, if you have ideas for topics for those round 2 questions, you can get those, however that process, to Neil, to Ashley, to me, and I can draft some questions up, and we'll look at those maybe even on the 17th as a beginning step, and you can again finalize those as you move forward. Because sometimes there is something that comes out in the interviews that you think, both of the candidates or the 3 candidates all kind of talked about that, but I'd like to know a little bit more about whatever that topic might be, and that's just fine. Okay. Any final questions about anything involved with the process, the training materials, how we're moving forward? You guys have asked really good questions tonight. Yeah, yeah. It's, it's interesting. I think we see this with boards, you start this process out and it kind of seems like, well, we're really not doing all that much. And all of a sudden, bango, here we go. You're moving really fast. Got a lot of things going on, a lot of information to go through and decipher and think about, because again, this is a really big decision and you all are well aware of that, so.
To what extent can, especially this second round of questions, to what extent can we construct that set of questions by communications, emails between board members, me, you, back and forth?
I think you'd have to be careful about doing a serial board meeting, which would be, so really, I think the best approach would be to get those questions to a central point through the board chair to Ashley, and then to me, and let me take a shot at it, and
construct a set of questions.
yeah. And just so you know, I mean, I've done this a lot, even as my days as a superintendent. I don't feel bad if you tell me I don't like that question. I don't think it's worded very well. I think you should do it differently.
But my point is, we can't agree either individually or collectively to that set of questions in private.
Correct. Yeah, it's public. Yeah, you're going to need to.
Simply collect the suggestions, bring them to us, and then we would then, as a group, publicly.
That's exactly right.
I just wanted to go back to, sorry, Dennis, you want to go back to the questions. I thought of something. I really like the questions, and I like how it's candidate focused, and I think that's how I would like to see it approached, that we're really focusing, like you talked about, the strengths of the candidate, in a way for them to kind of lift up and talk about themselves. I really like that approach.
Okay, thank you.
How do we carry ourselves? The interviews are open to the public.
Correct.
So they'll be out there. What happens when we finish and we've discussed, if we start getting a lot of calls from the audience, input or suggestions, what's our best plan of attack for working with that? Because I might get 20 calls from a certain group of people, Kim might, Jill might, we all are going to have different cores of people we're around. How do we deal with that?
I think that, just you're listening, you're taking in input, you're going to take into consideration the kinds of things that you hear in relation to what you've already identified as the kind of candidate you're looking for around those profiles. There are a lot of things can happen. I mean, it's not uncommon, even where board members will get calls from employees in the district that the candidate's in, either positive or negative. So you have to kind of filter that all out, and in the deliberation process, you're looking again for those strengths. If you found out something that was really concerning, I think there's a little bit of a challenge with that, to bring that out, because it may or may not be accurate if you're getting a comment. So I think, again, listen and get back to focus on the criteria, focus on the stakeholder input that you've received, focus on the positive attributes of the candidate, and those reference of the checks that we've done, but also the reference checks that you do are going to be really important. That should be really telling, because you're getting then that information from the person or persons who are responsible for that employment of that individual.
My response to that, Dennis, is based on the experience so far, and you said the key word, listen. Listen, and then say, thank you for your input. And I will consider it. And the worst thing you can do is get in an argument with someone if you don't agree with them. Just say thank you very much for your input. It will be a consideration in the process.
And hopefully what we would be hearing will be similar to all of us. So I'm guessing you'll have concerned citizens, which is great, and as long as they're making the effort to communicate and keep us informed,
Oh,
I
yeah.
think that's a positive.
We need a positive response to their input.
Yes.
Because that's what we're here for.
Other questions for me?
Can we ask the board what they would like posted on the web
Yes. So from this
from this
meeting?
meeting?
Specifically, I would assume the stakeholders' results. Um, the potential, obviously, is for us to have the whole document available on our website.
Document you looked at tonight.
Yeah, typically this document you would see, yep. And, I don't think that you've, unless you think differently, I don't think you've given away any
No.
any questions that would give a upside to anybody. So putting this meeting out there.
It's easy to do, it doesn't hurt anything, and might
Yeah.
address some concerns out there. So my recommendation would be go ahead and post it. I don't think we need any, just a consensus is fine, and I think we have that.
All right.
What other documents or information needed?
So it would take us several days, as we're, to get the video updated of this meeting. If you're interested in that, it will be probably this week, next week.
The question and answer.
This meeting.
Oh, this meeting, okay.
That does make me think of one question. After we're done with our first round of interviews, will that video be able to be posted very quickly so people can watch it if they want to? Or is that a challenge? We'll have to see. So that is the last week of school, but we can attempt to do that. We don't have the staff member who typically has done that on staff anymore, so we'll have to pull other staff to do that work. But certainly, if that's what the board would like, we would work as quickly as we can to make that happen.
Anything else?
Actually, just one other question popped into my
Yeah.
mind too. We're not streaming, because we don't do that anyway, but we're not streaming the video of the first round of interviews so that the candidates on the second day don't have an advantage.
Yeah.
What if members of the audience come and do this, because that has happened before? They're live streaming to Facebook or something. I suppose they can just do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I suppose that's unfortunate because by the luck of the draw, some candidates may have an advantage over others. But on the other hand, I would think that if these people are, to the extent that they are qualified to apply for this position, they probably are pretty savvy in terms of what the questions are going to be anyway.
And we could make a statement that we would prefer if there's no live streaming, so it's an even ground for all the candidates, because they may not even have thought about that.
All right. Thank you very much. We'll look forward to our meeting on the 17th, and hopefully we'll have a pile of good candidates to look through.